Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Staple Inn. We're gathered here today to partake in a sessional research event, the Actuarial Function Working Party. As you're probably aware, the life of pretty well every single actuary in the insurance industry is going to be affected by the actuarial function of the Solvency II. So we're grateful to Jahan and Matthew for studying all the implications and writing a very useful paper. And this evening we're going to discuss it. Just before we start, I'd like to just run through the normal housekeeping notes. So do please ensure your mobile phones are switched off and silent. If a fire alarm sounds, it won't be a practice, it'll be real. And please leave by the nearest fire exit, which I can see a big green sign over there. And then staff will help you to the muster point, which used to be said was the Melton Mowbray pub. I don't know if it's still the same, but that's an incentive to get away from the fire. The event is being filmed, it says here. I don't think we are filming today, are we? Oh, sorry, yes, we are. Apologies. Yep. The event's being filmed, so do please wait for a microphone in the Q&A session, which will take place at the end of a presentation, which our dear colleagues will give to us. Hopefully you've had time to read and inwardly digest the paper that's been on the website for the last while. We have two presenters today, Jahan and Anzsar. Jahan's a qualified actuary, over 10 years experience in the general insurance market. He's head of UK and EMEA reinsurance reserving at XL Catlin, and he's worked on London market reserving as well as Solvency II related projects. And he's been involved in a number of the profession's GI working parties, including the IMAP working party, as well as, of course, this Actuarial Function Working Party. Outside of work, Jahan says he's a part-time golfer and proud of becoming a father for the first time. And I'll catch that later, mate, Jahan. Matthew is a qualified actuary with 13 years' experience in the UK general insurance market, following 5 years previously in life and pensions. He's head of GI Actuarial at NFU Mutual, been involved in a wide range of pricing, reserving and capital work throughout his career, and also had extensive involvement in his firm's Solvency II preparations. Since the days of Quiz 1 back in 2005, God, that's a painful memory, isn't it? I always say to people I've been working on Solvency II since 2009, but is it longer than that? Oh dear. And outside of work, Matthew's married and a variety of interesting hobbies, including photo editing and medal collecting. So, our colleagues are going to start off with a presentation on the paper. I think you're going to use the lectern, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everybody to our session today. So here's our agenda for today's session. First, I'll be giving a brief introduction to our working party and the paper, and then Jahan and I will talk through three of the key challenges that the paper has highlighted regarding opinions, the structure of the actuarial function, and finally, how to ensure independence. And we'll then have time for questions from the floor. So, this is where it all begins, Article 48. And if you're interested enough in the actuarial function to be attending our presentation today, it's probably safe to assume you've already read this at least once, so I'm not expecting you to read it again from the slide. As you'll know, Article 48 sets out the tasks and requirements of the actuarial function, specifically the oversight of technical provision calculations, expressing opinions on underwriting and reinsurance, and contributing to risk management. Our working party was established in April 2013 by Richard Williams. Our aim was to provide practical insights and suggestions around the requirements of the Solvency II Directive. Our aim was not to give people the answer, not least because we don't think there is one answer, but we hoped we could help actuaries to understand what the requirements mean and begin to think how best they could be met within their own firms. It's important to note our standard disclaimer. The views expressed within the report, and indeed in this presentation, are the views of individual members of the working party. The views of regulatory and professional bodies should normally take priority. And that brings us to an operational challenge we faced in trying to draft our paper. We had a moving target. Every few months as our draft paper took shape, a new consultation paper or further update to regulation would be released, some of which provided helpful additional clarity, but all of which meant we had to review everything we'd done so far. And of course, the regulators still have time to issue more information before the 1st of January 2016. So whilst our paper is as up to date as possible, if you believe there's something we've missed, please let us know. Our paper was deliberately quite broad in scope because the challenge, or perhaps opportunity, that the actuarial function presents to firms isn't just about what Article 48 sets out as the requirements. It's perhaps even more importantly about how you deliver it. More on that in a moment, but now I'm going to hand over to Jahan, who's going to give his opinion on opinions.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt said, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the requirements of the actuarial function to express an opinion and focus a bit of time on the opinions covering the overall underwriting policy as well as adequacy of reinsurance arrangements. So what's to be expected? Well, this is one of the most common questions the working party had throughout its lifespan. We think there's considerable benefit both for the insurer concerned as well as the regulators in the actuarial function contributing its knowledge and experience to the wider sound running of the insurer. Underwriting policy and reinsurance adequacy have been singled out as the areas most suited to this, and where historically actuaries in some insurers may have had less involvement. But we believe an opinion in this sense is therefore not a formal signing off of the underwriting policy or reinsurance arrangements in the style of, say, a statement of actuarial opinion. It's more a view on the practices and outcomes in these areas from applying the actuarial skill set. And although the actuarial team within some insurers already provide such a contribution, Solvency II will formalize this role and set a minimum level of contribution, bringing all insurers up to a common standard, but also giving everyone sufficient flexibility to adapt to the specific circumstances of the insurer. The delegated acts issued also lay down some considerations required before an opinion can be given. So here's some further detail on what might be involved in providing an opinion on underwriting policy and reinsurance adequacy, both of which should be supported by reasoned analysis. Providing an opinion on underwriting policy may involve comparison of actual profitability and premium rate movements by each business segment to your business planning expectations. It may also involve an assessment of the ability to make profit targets. For example, return on equity, both under best estimate and stressed economic conditions, for example, high inflationary claims environment or via a loss distribution. Consideration of external and internal influences on premium rates should also come into play. And there should be consideration of the impact of the underwriting policy on the technical provisions and vice versa. In providing the opinion on the adequacy of reinsurance, the actuarial function may wish to consider analyzing the historical use and outcomes of the reinsurance program, carrying out a forecast of gross and net profit distributions, identifying and highlighting any perceived limitations in the reinsurance program, and assessing the process for deciding on the creditworthiness of reinsurers. Now, as part of assessing the adequacy of the reinsurance program, we feel it's also important to have regard to the stated risk appetite of the insurer, both with regard to the level of reinsurance cover in place and the resulting credit risk of the reinsurers used. For such opinion work to be effective and efficient, the actuarial function really needs to embed its work in the area with the processes and timetable of the underwriting and reinsurance teams. Close working relationship and mutual cooperation would be essential. And whilst it's not envisaged that the actuarial function acts as a policeman to the underwriting and reinsurance teams, it's important that it positions itself so that it can still provide constructive criticism and informed debate, and not simply rubber stamp the work of the other teams. Documentation of the actuarial function's work in deriving its views will be essential in demonstrating compliance in this area, as it is indeed elsewhere in its obligations under the directive. And of course, the main written output will be the actuarial function report, setting all of this out. I'm going to hand back to Matt now, who's going to discuss a bit more, talk a bit more about the nature and the structure of the actuarial function. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Jahan. So there are many things to consider when deciding how to set up your actuarial function, but we've identified 4 key needs. One is meeting the requirements of the regulations and other guidance. One is addressing issues of independence and objectivity, deciding on a chief actuary for the PRA, and the availability of suitably qualified and experienced resource. Our paper explores all of those points in some detail, and Jahan will talk more about independence and objectivity in a moment. Other things to consider include how the rest of the firm is organised, ensuring that you reflect the organisation's complexity, the nature and degree of interaction with other departments, and so on. One additional thought raised in a recent discussion with another member of our working party was, what is the nature of delivery to the board? And for me, this is almost the so what of the actuarial function. And by that I mean it focuses on the potential value that the actuarial function will be providing for the organisation. Your actuarial function might be providing board with assurance that a second-line review has found no major problems with first-line activity. They might be providing evidence that the Solvency II regulations have been complied with. Or they might be strategically supporting decision-making in the organisation. Or indeed, they might be trying to do all of these things. I think that viewing things from this perspective early on, with firms asking themselves what value they would like their actuarial function to add, could influence how they choose to organise themselves, particularly around the interactions with first-line departments and the practicalities of how the report is structured and delivered. So now I'll hand you back to Jahan to talk in more detail about the challenge of ensuring independence and objectivity.
Okay, so the PRA have made clear their expectations around the actuarial function, and in particular being independent of an insurer's revenue-generating functions, but also possessing sufficient authority to offer robust challenge to the business. So to achieve this, I think we need to consider how you separate performing work from reviewing work. It's hardly a new issue for us, but it's one receiving new focus when trying to decide where the actuarial function sits within an insurer. And often used is the lines of defense model. So where you have the first line of defense being the risk management by the business operations, the second line of defense being independent risk control and compliance, and the third line being internal audit. But how do you implement the first and second lines in practice? So I think you could consider 2 possible setups within an insurer. At one extreme, you have one team which both performs and reviews the work. And clearly there's a possibility with this scenario of conflicts of interest and self-review. And then on the other extreme, there's a completely separate business support function to act as a reviewer. But will it understand the business as well as the doers? And is this a disproportionate response? Of course, each of these 2 extremes have their relative strengths and weaknesses. So can we have the best of both worlds, a sort of middle way? And I think in order to achieve this, we need to consider a number of factors to find the right balance, which will be different for each organization. We should consider, for example, segregation of responsibilities to the degree that it is practical. For example, do we need a separate team that only perform the work and other teams that only review the work? We should have reporting lines designed to minimize conflicts of interest. But should we use the 3 lines of defense model? Do we need gatekeeping of inputs, models, and outputs where a controller monitors these independent of the doers and reviewers? Do we need a peer review regime, and if so, who? How do we establish clear policies for expert judgment and governance review of material decisions? And what robust documentation can we establish of agreed procedures and explaining assumptions, judgments, and results? So we think these are all factors to consider, taking into account, obviously, the nature, the scale, and the complexity of the insurer. So those are the main points that we wanted to draw out from the Working Party paper. I think as well as your questions, we'd be keen to hear about your experiences implementing all of this and the issues you came across and how you resolved them. I'll hand back to Andrew. Thank you.
So thank you to Matthew and Jahan for a good summary of their paper. They've drilled into 3 specific topics. What does an opinion achieve in the new environment? Then how to structure the actuarial function, and then finally searching for independence and objectivity. We're not constrained to those topics. We can ask questions about all sorts of topics this evening. I'm now going to throw the floor open to questions from the audience. As I said at the beginning, it would be really helpful if you waited for a microphone to give your question. Let me see who wants to break the ice and start the conversation rolling. Well, let me start with my first question. So you mentioned somewhere earlier on an opinion's not the same as a sign-off. So I've got two questions from you on that, and then we'll ask the audience to contribute their opinions on this as well. First of all, how well do you think boards understand that difference? It could be a subtle difference, or it could be clearly obvious. And then secondly, I'd be interested, either from you guys or from the audience, asking for feedback from people who've had examples of positive feedback from the board, where they found the opinion, they expressed that the opinion was actually very useful, went almost beyond what they were expecting. So if I perhaps leave the question with you, first of all, how well do you think boards will understand that difference between an opinion and a sign-off?
I think, to start us off, I guess, in terms of, so you're talking about the distinction between not having a formal sign-off in the way of an actuarial opinion would provide.
So a science, in the midst of time, a board would regard a sign-off to the reserves that that's the right number to put in the accounts.
Yeah.
And now they've been persuaded that they own the actual reserves and they get an opinion here. And then when you come to the underwriting policy, you've given an opinion. Is that endorsing it? Is it criticising it, recommending it for change? I'd just be interested.
I think we felt that, I mean, a lot of the first line of defence, if you like, would probably be doing a lot of the analysis, some of the things that we've listed as what you might need to do to provide that underwriting opinion. But then I guess the opinion provided would validate that, would assess it for reasonableness, and comment on any further areas potentially that might need to be picked up as part of that. So I think we saw it as perhaps an endorsement of what's already being done to some extent, but also highlighting any limitations as well. I think that's key. So it's more bringing, I guess, a second pair of eyes in some ways. Matt, I don't know if there's anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think what it does highlight is the need for firms to be having very clear discussions about what these things mean. So in a way, it might be, how well do boards understand that difference will vary between different boards at different firms, and even between different directors, exec and non-exec. But I think having an open conversation about what this second line review is doing and exactly what it does or doesn't provide by way of, I don't know, guarantee or review. I suppose probably it's one of those things where the value is in having that discussion. And in that sense, it's probably better than if it was just a sort of written opinion that was just, you know, almost a tick box exercise.
Andrew, we have a question from the gentleman over here.
Thank you. Andrew Newman. First, let me praise the paper. Because nobody's done that yet. So I thought it was excellent. There's an awful lot in it. It's very clearly structured. It's very well set out, and we know what you think, and I think it's very helpful. So thank you very much for it. In regards to the question that was asked about how does opinion differ from a statement of actuarial opinion, I think one of the key sign-off. I think one of the key things there is the sign-off says it's okay. You're not allowed to. You can't sign off the reserves at Lloyd's unless you think the number's large enough. Whereas an opinion can say, I don't think the number is large enough. And indeed, in the paper you set out, I think it's section 725, 2 ways that you might go around giving an underwriting opinion. One is that you have an independent actuarial opinion that says one thing, and it's up to the board to decide how to reconcile the actuaries and the underwriters' views. And the other one is the more working together route. So I think that first idea crystallizes a difference between an opinion. The actuary can have an opinion, and the board has to make its mind up. And if the board doesn't, then it just happens at the level of management, where the actuary has an opinion, the underwriter has an opinion, and you lock them together in a room before the board meeting. And one of them comes out. There was a question I had, on the actuarial function report. I know it's not a topic that you've raised as one of your key 3, but it's one that bothers me. There's in 543 you say that the actuarial function report should not be too technical or too long for review by the board, and yet in section 6 you have the view that it should include a detailed description as to how the technical provisions are calculated. I'm with the first view you expressed, that it shouldn't be too technical for their review or too long for their attention span. And I don't think we can square that with a detailed description as to how the technical provisions are calculated. And it's linked to the documentation of the work that you mentioned in 7.1. I don't think that necessarily needs to be included in the report that goes to the board. And I think even if you stick it in appendices that aren't going to be read, I don't think that's particularly helpful either. But I will leave that for the moment and let other people speak.
Would you like to build on those comments?
Yeah, I think bearing in mind the intended audience of the report is absolutely key. I think something that we've sort of debated what we thought. I mean, you've got a number of different audiences here. You've got the board, obviously, and bearing in mind their experience and understanding, but you've also got to demonstrate that you've carried out a robust technical analysis of what's needed. And we almost felt that the report could have, to start with, if you like, a level 0, you know, the key points you wanted to draw to the board's attention. And then to satisfy some of the other needs, you could either include some of the detail in the backing sections or refer to other more detailed reports as part of that. But it was a difficult one, given that you've got a number of different stakeholders that are leaning on the report, and structuring it accordingly with the right level of prior knowledge assumed is challenging.
I think it's an absolutely fair challenge. I don't think it's one that's unique to the Actuarial Function report. I think since the Solvency II rules have come along and obliged senior management and board to really understand limitations, assumptions, approximations and things involved within Solvency II calculations. I think it's a challenge that a lot of actuaries working in capital and reserving, perhaps especially, are already facing and already had a go at. I don't have the answer, other than, as Jahan said, it might be a range of approaches, but I'll just give a little plug to another working party I'm on called the Good Actuarial Report Working Party. One of the things that we're looking at in that working party is how we might find some pragmatic ways to address this kind of thing.
Again, to both of you, thank you very much for an excellent paper and indeed a really excellent introduction to it in your talks earlier. I have two very small questions which I'd like to pose to Jahan because he mentioned them. On your slide concerning opining on the reinsurance part, you had, on the reinsurance report, you said that the actuary must opine on the creditworthiness of the reinsurer. Now, from my point of view, actuaries are wonderful and they are masters of all they see and do, but I would question whether they have got expertise in actually opining on creditworthiness, and I'm wondering if the board would accept the actuary as being the final arbiter in that and would seek a second opinion in any case, whatever the actuary said. If you care to comment on that. And the second point was, you mentioned that right towards the end, whether the actuary in preparing his reports on whatever matter would need to seek a second opinion or peer review. And maybe because maybe some of your thoughts predated the 1st of July 2015, I was wondering whether you might update that in the line of APSX2.
And just for the record, that's Neil Hillary, who's so famous he doesn't need to give his name. Jahan, take those questions.
Yeah, so I think on your first point around providing an opinion on the creditworthiness of reinsurers, I think certainly actuaries do a lot of work in that space, but they're not the only people that the board can, I guess, lean on to provide a view on that. But I think we can certainly provide some challenge on any other work done, say, by the reinsurance purchasing team around that. And I think also having a view of the risk appetite of the reinsurer, of the insurer, and does the profile of reinsurers that they're placing reinsurance with fit with that? But yeah, I think there's other professionals in the firm that could certainly provide useful input on that decision. But I think we're sort of flagging that we're one of those groups that could provide some insight into that piece. On your second point on the peer review, yes, absolutely, there is now a peer review regime in place. I thought we had referenced APSX2, but yeah, absolutely, that's now in place, and the profession has issued that, and there is a framework within which we can operate now around peer review and implementing that. So. Absolutely, given the audience and the decision making that falls off the back of it. Yeah.
I just had a quick look at my crib sheet, and I think our paper brilliantly just mentions that APSX2 needs to be considered without explaining how to go about it. So we'll leave that for members of the profession. Just briefly back to the first point on reinsurance and creditworthiness. At my firm, I've been lucky enough to serve on the Reinsurance Security Committee, which, working with our reinsurance colleagues, looking at which reinsurers we wished to place our business with. And I've now extracted myself from that, so I don't get into any conflict. But one of the things I think we can usefully do is critique the way in which our firms choose reinsurers to place business with. Do they simply follow the credit rating? And if so, do they look at more than one or whatever? Do they use their own expert judgment? And if so, how do they arrive at that? And there's probably some simple tests like, how often have reinsurers they place business with subsequently been downgraded? So that might be some analysis that they might already be doing, but if not, it might be something we could have a go at. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Do we have a next question?
David Martin. The last comment about APSX2 refers back to really ISAP 1, which is the International Actuarial Association standard, which required consideration of peer review. That's reflected in the European standard ESAP 1. There's another one on its way called ESAP 2, which is in connection with writing the reports for actuarial function holders. I didn't see a reference to it in the list of references at the end, but I might have missed it. I just wondered whether that had been taken into account. It's quite close to completion now, and will obviously have some kind of impact.
Quick answer is no.
No, I wasn't familiar with it, but thank you very much.
I think we were only aware of, I guess, is it in the public domain as yet, or I'm guessing?
Yes, there's been consultation on it, and it's available on the website, and it's very close to publication.
Okay, yeah.
So we'll get in touch with Richard and ask him why he didn't include it.
Yeah. But we published, back in July, I think it was.
Yeah, I think we'd pretty much finished our paper by the end of last year, and then there was quite a long peer review. So if it came out between last year and now, that might have been why we hadn't had a chance to get a big section on it.
Yes, in fact, there have been 2 consultations on it, and there's been a working version for use of actuaries in the meantime.
Okay.
We can get that reference, I'm sure.
Hi, Tim Burse. Perhaps I can help with a comment from the other side of the fence, or from the life industry. For a number of years now, the statutory reserving, valuation bases and amounts of reserves have become the responsibility of the board, where previously they were the responsibility of the actuary. And it has taken, in my experience with more than one board, a long time to continually beat this into their heads without being rude about board members, or without being too rude about board members. It just needs continual reinforcement that this is your basis, not the actuary's basis. And I can't think of any better way of putting the actuarial report in this context into boards' minds than continual pressure and continual repetition, explanation of what it is about, particularly when boards have had a long experience of the status quo.
Yep. Thank you for that. We have a question at the back.
Malcolm Kemp. I just want to return to your original question, Andrew. I think it would be useful to have greater clarification on what an opinion is or isn't. Just looking at some published report and accounts, what the auditors sign off on is an opinion. They express an opinion as to whether something is true and fair. And I suspect that if you asked many board members, that's what they would envisage an opinion to be. So if that isn't the kind of opinion that we are going to offer, then we need to be very clear that that isn't the case.
That's an important distinction there. We have a question in the front row, please.
Yes, thank you. Julian Lee. A number of things. Firstly, the question of who is the actuarial function report for and these opinions for. I have to say that from my perspective, the answer is certainly not the board. I don't believe that the board is remotely interested in receiving an opinion on the underwriting policy from me. They can get one from the underwriters, all of whom sit on the board. However, I have to produce an actuarial function report because it's legally required and because Lloyd's require it. And if Lloyd's don't like what we put in, they can sanction us, and that would be both expensive and embarrassing, and I wish to avoid that. So I have to produce the report as a whole, and indeed those opinions, to Lloyd's satisfaction. I think last year we had a couple of iterations before they were completely satisfied. On the question of opinions, the statement of actuarial opinion and the auditor's opinion are definitely binary. The accounts are a true and fair view, or they're not. The reserves are sufficient, or they're not. I don't see that that what we have in the Solvency II Directive express an opinion on the overall underwriting policy can possibly be framed in those terms. I think it must mean the ordinary English meaning of what an opinion is, and it isn't a certification. And I wonder if we would be in quite this difficulty over it if, 15 or so years ago, when they set up the current regime, Lloyd's had said they wanted an actuarial certificate of the reserves, and we wouldn't already have got hung up on the word opinion. On the question of independence, it is all very well in a large organisation to insist on independent review and the independence of the actuarial function from anyone who's actually doing something useful. In a small organisation, it's verging on the impossible. The expense ratios in the London market, and especially the Lloyd's market, are such that contemplating such a thing would be virtually ruinous. We have managed on both the actuarial function and the validation of our internal model by using a model that is partly external, partly internal. The external one provides a fair measure of independence, and in the internal part we do try to, certainly with the validation of the model, try to have important parts carried out by people who have no other involvement with the model. But we disclose entirely in our validation report and the actuarial function report what we perceive the level of independence is. And in a small organisation, I think that's all we can aim for.
Thank you for that, Julian. I wonder if we could have any more feedback from the audience, how they've found this issue of managing the independence of the actuarial function report, particularly in a small to medium firm. Or if we can hold that question, I'll come back to it later because I can see another question there in the second row.
It's Robert Paul. A bit like Tim Burse, I'm creeping into the lion's den here because I'm actually, by history, a life factory. I thought it was an excellent paper and a good read, but just two observations of things perhaps I thought might have been missing. At the expense of coming back to the subject, I was rather nervous of the topic of opinions because there wasn't any reference to a legal opinion. I do fear that that may come back to haunt us, what exactly is meant by an opinion, and then when we're asked for something else very similar, how are we going to distinguish between the two? I do fear there's some scope for some nasty liabilities in future from that. The other one, perhaps less surprising from my background, is I was interested by the lack of cross-reference to life experience, or indeed any recognition of how Solvency II is going to cause convergence. Just to give some idea of where I'm coming from, looking at periodic payment orders, say out of motor books, the results of those look remarkably similar to annuities to me, yet under the current Solvency I regime, you get some very startlingly different answers and very startlingly different reports. under Solvency II, I don't believe that that should be possible, simply because the way Solvency II is worded is going to cause those to come very close indeed. Yes, I do wonder whether we may end up with function holders coming from the non-life side having a different set of analysis and reports to someone from the life side, and whether we ought to be nervous of this. So that's just my two observations on a quick run through.
Do you want to build on those guys, or?
Yeah, I think those are both good points. Legal opinion, or legal view of what an opinion is, I don't think that was something we discussed within the working party, but as you say, it might have been an oversight. As I think my brief biography at the beginning said, I had done a little bit of work in the life team at NFE Mutual before I moved across to General. So when I saw PPOs, the first thing I thought is this is just like an annuity. So I called up my colleague in life and asked him for his spreadsheet to value them. So yeah, I think a lot of the Solvency II work, especially where, like with the actuarial function, the legislation doesn't distinguish between life and non-life, I think it will drive harmonisation. I think what we might see at the beginning, for that and for other reasons as well, is quite a variety of approaches being taken. I expect after a year or two, someone like the PRA might be minded to issue a 1 year on kind of paper like they did after ICA, which might help harmonise approaches that firms have taken. And when Jahan and I were discussing this, I think you know, maybe that's something a working party or another working party could take forward in a year's time to say, well, how are people doing this and how similar is it looking, and what can people learn from that?
Thank you for that. Alex.
Good evening, Alex Marcuson. Thank you again. Just echo some of the comments of others earlier about an excellent paper. I wanted to make 3 observations. First is one area that I think you might look at exploring is the aspect of professionalism and how the actuarial function interacts with some of the aspects of the Actuaries Code. There are important aspects there about integrity and speaking up to our clients. And in complex organisations, the challenges for actuaries about working with a number of different external actuarial actuaries who are assisting. And I think that's a complex position to be in, and I think an area where senior actuaries would probably value having some discussion and debate as to what is the best way to fulfil that role and how to manage some of those challenges. The second one, I wanted to pick up on one of the comments that you made about working together, because I think it's one of these ones that sort of has a sort of slight yes minister feel to it in terms of irregular verbs. But the serious point I want to make is that how do you deal with the working together model? And I can see there's a lot of value in that for helping our clients in those situations where you find that you have fundamental disagreements. And how you resolve those, and really the challenge that arises is you take the approach of thinking, well, we're working together, we're all part of the team, but then when in hindsight something goes wrong, you as the actuarial function are the one who is standing alone and left carrying the can, and just the difficulties and dangers of that. So you want to take a collaborative approach and you rely on others, but actually, and you may say, well, we're not going to look at this in so much detail, or yes, there's a bit under and over in this place or that place. But actually, when the problem emerges, you may very well have said, well, I didn't look at this, this, and this, or these are the following limitations. But if those limitations may not be able to provide you with a sufficiently strong defence, so I think thinking about those and how you make the working together model work, harking back to the point about being able to speak up to your clients. And that leads me to the third point and question, And I know you talk about, there's a very interesting section about the different stakeholders that the actuarial function has to interact with. But it seems to me that fundamentally, as actuaries, we are in this slightly difficult position where we have a fundamental duty to policyholders and to shareholders. Our clients fundamentally are shareholders, who are the ones who employ us, whether as an employee or as an external supplier. However, if you look at the tone of Solvency II and our role in Solvency II, the obligations seem to be very much slanted towards our obligations towards policyholders. Now, I think it's great that in this room tonight we've got a number of very experienced life insurance actuaries who have, no doubt, many of them dealt with that dilemma and how you finesse that. Because it's clearly very important that we get this right, and actually when it works and works well, is hugely valuable to our clients. But I wonder sort of whether you have any thoughts about that one.
So I hope you managed to keep track of all three questions there, guys. I'll help you out if you forget one of the later ones, were. Who wants to go first?
I think that was a really good articulation of some of the hardest bits of doing this in practice. And I'm not sure, I mean, certainly speaking personally, I'm not sure I've cracked that yet. I think that's one of these things that will come out as people get going for real next year. So, as you say, if the actuarial function is really going to be adding value, we need to be speaking up if we think there's something that isn't right or could be better. And we need to speak up about that in sufficiently strong a way that it's not just rebutted immediately by first line as, oh, well, yeah, that was on my list of things to do as well, but isn't that important or I'd have done it, or something like that. And I think highlighting, as you have done, professionalism and the Actuaries Code is a really helpful point there. And then, what's the, yes, stakeholders, policyholders and shareholders. I'll pass to Jahan.
I think on well, just touching on the first one, what kind of came to mind there, I think, Alex, you mentioned when things go wrong, where does the buck stop, as it were? You know, you've done your independent view, etc., stated your limitations. I think there has to be an element of collective accountability to some extent, difficult as it may be. But that was kind of the first thing that came to mind as you were setting out sort of difficult scenarios that may arise in practice. And also sort of reiterating Matt's point about having that voice. I think having those diplomacy and negotiation skills is quite a key element of whoever takes up that actuarial function holder role, and something we mention in the report as well. The difficult different stakeholders, is a challenge, certainly. I guess we've of course got to bear policyholders and so on in mind, you know, as key stakeholders. But it's almost, I think, wearing different hats to some extent at the same time, bearing in mind those different stakeholders and how they might view what you're doing and the course of action that you're taking. I don't think there's a silver bullet there to deal with each situation. I don't know if anyone else has any further thoughts on that.
Perhaps I should just be glad I'm working for a mutual, so that there aren't any shareholders, just the policyholders.
A suggestion, Martin White, suggestion I would make on this is that even if you do so in a relatively light-hearted way, you've got to make sure that the people you work with appreciate that you have an element of your job which is policyholders first. And you take gentle opportunity to remind them of that now and then. That means that they will respect it, more likely to respect it, as and when you choose to put your foot down.
Thank you. So, Andrew, are you willing for a second bite?
Thank you, Andrew Newman. Again, there's 10.3.2 talks about the CFO, relationship with the CFO, and suggests that one of the reasons you need to get on well with the CFO is that he or she would be the person presenting your report to the board often. That's certainly my experience, but I should point out that under the proposed actuarial professional standard for the new practicing certificates regime, it's being proposed that an actuary accepting the position of chief actuary under the new regime should ensure that they have the possibility of presenting in person to the board should they deem it sufficiently serious. I just flag that now, but I think your point that it'll often be the CFO is well made.
So in a few minutes, I'm going to ask the audience to give us some feedback. I'm particularly interested to hear if people have got experiences of an opinion that's been positively received by the board. It's quite easy, I suspect, when some of us started on this road some time ago, it's quite easy when you say you're going to give an opinion on underwriting policy or reinsurance arrangements to imagine that some of the audience will think you'll just come out with criticisms and negatives. So I would be interested to ask the audience in a few minutes if they can be thinking about some examples they've seen of positive feedback from boards, where the opinion's been welcomed, it's been used by the firm perhaps, or the recommendations made are being followed through and the board have found those very helpful. While you're thinking about such examples, I'm just going to ask Matthew and Jahan a quick question. This is an echo from something we see in validation of the internal model. It's how you maintain independence over time. So in one sense, if you're given a recommendation this year for an improvement or a change to the underwriting policy, and then they're followed through dutifully, when you come to review that underwriting policy next year, you're kind of marking your own homework in a way. You're kind of reviewing what you suggested a year ago. So is that just a chimera, or how do you maintain independence over time if they follow too many of your recommendations?
I think that's a really good point and probably a difficult one to answer. I just feel like I'm evading all the questions today. That's probably one where perhaps the APS X2 review can kind of help, in that you'll at least have hopefully some sort of peer review of the first view you gave and the second view you gave. So if it starts to look a little bit like all you're doing is, you've said do X, Y, Z, they've done X, Y, Z, you're now saying that's fine. Hopefully the peer review you're getting done internally or externally would spot that and ask you to perhaps reconsider.
I think, if they've put through all your or dealt with all your limitations, then that's a big tick for them in the following year. I guess in my experience, the landscape often changes, and there's often new factors to bear in mind, particularly if the underlying business has evolved in some way, or the book has changed. So I'd imagine there's always new things to grapple with and try and ensure that we're doing the best possible we can.
That's a fair answer. And going back to my previous question, you mentioned limitations there, but have you, in your experience of working with other folks, come across good examples of opinions that have helped the board to a recommendation where they've found it valuable? It's tricky, isn't it? It's from the audience. Anybody willing to share with us? Let me ask you first of all, how many in the audience have actually written their first actuarial function reports and had it reviewed by the board? So we've got a small sprinkling. So I've got a small audience to ask for any observations. From that small sprinkling of 4 or 5 hands, is anybody willing to share with us some of the, anonymised basis of course, some of the recommendations that they might have made, or parts of their opinion that were interested in the board were pleasantly surprised to find that? Andrew, do you want to have a go?
I'm afraid I can't answer that part of the question. What I can say is that once you start talking about technical provisions, their eyes glaze over. And even if you do adopt the approach here recommended on page 17 of producing 2 waterfall charts of movements and explaining the movements between the waterfall charts of movements, which is something I did this year, they didn't glaze over quite as much, but they still couldn't quite see the point.
Martin White again, 2 cheeky comments. First one, if their eyes all glaze over, does that mean they're fit for the job as a team? And the second one is, Andrew, you asked us for good news, good reports.
Yes.
You should, to be fair, ask for the opposite too.
Well, I just didn't want it to sound as though actuaries our sole aim in life is to find faults with other people's policies and reinsurance arrangements. So let's, Andrew, keep going.
I'm going to have to retract glazed over and say, looked at me wondering when the main event was going to start.
Yes. They're looking for the far horizons, that's the phrase, isn't it, Andrew? That's interesting, though. When I asked how many people in the audience had actually sent their first actuarial function report, I got a very small sprinkling. So I can't do anything other. Is that because you've actually sent draft reports to your board and you thought I just meant a final one? That's Lloyd's. I'm just wondering, and again, we have a company in-house and we've done a dry run actuarial report to our board for the most obvious reasons that if they don't like it, we want to find out before the 1st of January 2016. So I'm not quite sure what question's emerging in my mind here. Yeah, I'm just curious. Are you guys, when let me ask it differently. When are people going to do their first dry run actuarial function report to their boards? This year or next year? Those who've already done one, don't say. So those who haven't done one, are you going to do your dry run actuarial function report this year or next year? So this year, put your hand up. Oh my goodness. 1. Heavens. I have to give you some friendly advice here, guys. You need to get a dry run out very fast because you heard Andrew, he didn't mean glazed over, of course. He meant that they were looking at the fine print. But it is explaining Solvency II technical provisions. Maybe in the life industry you guys have had more technical things to explain to boards, but explaining all the technical parts of Solvency II technical provisions to a non-life board is quite a challenge, so you do need to get a practice in as early as possible. That's just a friendly piece of advice. You're probably too late for the Q4 2015 boards now, aren't you?
You heard it here first.
Yes, yes. So, now we seem to be slowly running out of burning questions. I don't know if I'd hate to miss out on anybody's. They've come here to learn a particular point and we missed it.
My name's Tony Jeffrey. I've just got one comment. Really, I think you've undercooked the bit about interaction with the risk function, particularly for a company that's running an internal model. I think you're going to find, I think you're suggesting that the Irish party was pushing this quite strongly, and I would agree with them. I think you can be spending an awful lot of time as an actuarial function interacting with the risk function because the capital is now equal to the movement in own funds, which implicitly means the movement in your technical reserves. So I think you need to treat that as a more important stakeholder than you seem to have put it at.
If I may just chuck another one in. It's a bit of a minor pedantic point, but I did wonder whether it might be useful to include some reference to the way in which actuarial functions are implemented through FSMA, i.e. primary UK legislation. Certainly as a life actuary, I've found it occasionally useful to point out the powers that are given to the actuarial function in terms of demanding information that are set out in FSMA that go well beyond what is actually built into the regulator's rules. And I've not gone through the fine print of everything that's emerged in the last few weeks, but I suspect the same will apply when we get through to 1st of January 2016. So it might just be worth to have a think of that, because it is quite a useful added point.
So in terms of having ready access to...
Yeah, I'd suggest it's worth going back to the wording of FSMA in terms of actuarial function in primary legislation, because it looked to me, when I was last worrying about these things, that may well carry over into Solvency II and could be quite useful.
Yeah.
Martin White again, a response to that point. I was looking up what the actuarial function was in general insurance in terms of the legislation, and I could see total silence on it, apart from basically life actuaries. So I don't think the legislation as it currently exists goes into the general insurance field.
William Hewson, if I can just respond quickly to that point. FSMA and the various provisions in that will apply to any external actuary, either life or general, who is brought in, whereas for internal actuaries it would be the EU Solvency II regulation in particular that does require the provision of relevant information to all those within the firm who need it for the different functions that they're carrying on.
Thank you for that clarification. So if you guys can be thinking how you'd like to wrap up the session, any final comments on what you've heard? Are you happy to do that?
Yeah.
And then I'll just give the audience a last chance to ask. Oh, we've got Alex is still going strong.
Have another bite of the cherry. I wanted to just pick up on actuarial reports and the comments that boards don't like or don't appreciate detailed reports. And I think there's a couple of points and sort of observations. One was some of the work that we've done on the GI Reserve Oversight Committee suggests that there's a spectrum of views, and actually some boards actually quite appreciate a bit more detail than actuaries tend to give them credit for. I think it very much depends upon the board that you've got and that you're dealing with. The other stems from work on when you're looking at reserving as an external, and the challenges that you're faced if the actuarial report is actually quite slimmed down and doesn't have the information and there is no other report. Certainly that can be a real challenge, because you then get a document that is very glossy and tells the board it's all fine with a few nice pretty pictures. And actually your ability to get under the skin of the work that's been done to really form a view as to whether you agree or disagree is made enormously difficult, particularly because you are then coming in and needing to say, actually, you know, this piece of work that you thought was great and sufficient for all purposes, actually it is a very slimmed down report. And in a sense, the work, if it's not been documented elsewhere, they need to go back to square one and do it again. And that's a very difficult message to come in as another actuary, as an external, at a later stage. So I think there are some interesting issues to think about. If we're going to say, as an actuarial function, it's fine to do a report that is very focused on what the board wants, there needs to be a bit of a but there about making sure that there is not just a whole pile of spreadsheets that have the numbers in, but actually something that's wrapped up and properly documented so that there is a proper record of what's been done and how it's pulled together.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. I think that, Andrew Newman, that last point, I know the paper addressed it under 7.1, talking about how things do need to be documented. Didn't specify how things have to be documented there. But we do have rules under TASES about how things should be documented, actuarial standards promulgated by the Financial Reporting Council. In 541, I think that it's incorrect to say that if you're a member of the Institute and Faculty of Actuary, you have to follow the TASES. I think if the organisation that you're dealing with is in the UK and under the guideline and under the authority of the Financial Reporting Council, then whoever's doing the work will have to follow the technical actuarial standards because the FRC require it of the company. But I don't think that being a member of the Institute and Faculty automatically requires you to follow the TASES, though they would apply in the UK.
Okay, thank you for that, Andrew. Mr. Kipling.
Thank you, Mike Kipling. I'm a life actuary too, although first I was going to just slightly challenge my former colleague on the Professional Affairs Board about that last statement. It's certainly my understanding that the Code of Conduct requires actuaries to apply TASES to the work they do, and particularly if it's classed as reserved work for actuaries in statutory roles, which I speculate that the chief actuary role will be, both for general insurance and life insurance, as the actuarial function holder role for life insurance currently is. I'd also just like to say that whilst the life side has had a lot of experience of the role of the statutory actuary, it's somewhat less clear to us as well, I think, how the new role is going to operate. Certainly in my own firm, I sit next to the chap who's going to be the chief actuary from next year, and I think he's still very much sort of finding his way as to what his relationship is going to be with the other actuaries in the business. And in fact, the way we've organised things is that his working title is the chief risk actuary, and he sits in the risk function reporting to the CRO, whereas we also have a chief finance actuary who sits in the finance function reporting to the CFO, and at present they're certainly having lengthy discussions with each other as to quite who's responsible for what.
I'd love to be a fly on that wall, Mike. Andrew.
I guess about the TASES, chief actuary is not technically a reserve role because you don't have to be an actuary to do it. So, but I'm going to defer to Mike because he knows more than I do. And the TASES are all up for review anyway, and I'm just flagging that. So keep your eye on that ball.
Okay, so we're getting close to that time when you run out of time for your last burning question. I'm wondering if Matthew and Jahan, between you, want to organise a short summary of what you've heard this evening, any particular points arising, perhaps next developments you might be thinking about?
Yeah. I think that's been really useful, and thanks to everybody for your input. It was a shame Richard, the chair of the Working Party, couldn't make it today. He had a prior engagement. But when Jahan and I asked him last week in an attempt to prepare what difficult questions might we expect, he said, "Oh, it'll be fine." So I think the fact several of you have managed to stump us with some really good points show that this isn't a done deal with this is how to do the actuarial function. I think this is a new, exciting area area for actuaries to get involved with. I think, as I mentioned earlier, things will inevitably evolve, and regulators and professional bodies, I'm sure, will chip in as things commence. And so there's almost certainly more work for another working party, whether it's us or some others, to carry on and keep going with this. And I think the number of you attending today shows how much interest there is in this.
Yeah, I think it's been useful to hear some of the further pieces of legislation that may well apply. I think we'll take that back to the working party. Have your detailed feedback on certain parts of the report. I think, as Matt says, I think if we reconvene, at some point through next year, to hear how this works, operating in practice, perhaps war stories from the front line, as it were, I think that would be interesting, and also throw in some regulatory feedback once they've seen how this operates in practice and what could perhaps be done differently. Thank you.
Well, as I said at the very outset, the actuarial function role would impact almost all of us working in insurance. So I would invite you to put your hands together and thank Matthew and Jahan for the hard work they've done.